So I'd like to welcome Nevin Mulvihill for our first presentation this afternoon. We have never met in the flesh, but we do have some common acquaintances from Carlow, as some of. Nevin is a quantity surveyor with extensive industrial experience on excess of 300 million euros worth of mixed commercial, residential and industrial buildings. He has worked with PJ Hegarty's MKN and Collection Construction. He also has extensive experience of training and education, as working as an educator in TU Dublin and also at Red Train. So Nevin will now enlighten us about some of the mystery surrounding what the QS does, and I'll now hand you over to Nevin.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Martin. Yeah, mysteries is a very appropriate term for QSs. Sometimes we dwell in the grey world of misinformation and maybe design specification and trying to establish budgets based on a number of different factors. It's a little bit like maybe sometimes it's certainly a science, but sometimes there's a little bit more of an art to it than a science. So without further ado, I'd like to start this session. What I'd ask you to do is, if you have any questions, feel free to pop into the chat box. Martin can enlighten me as the questions come in if they do. We have 45 minutes in total, so I'll bring it back in line. You'd like me to finish up at 1:30. Is that right, Martin? Try and bring her back on time. So I've 27 slides and we'll have a discussion at the end, about a 15-minute discussion. So do feel free to ask questions either during it or at the end. What I sometimes find useful is to have a little car park, maybe a little box that's separate from my notes that I'm making, just to have some pertinent questions. And I'm also going to be asking you some pertinent questions as the presentation progresses. So the four key areas I'm going to be looking at in terms of cost estimates and budgets will be in accuracy, the accuracy of the preparation and the information that's used in the preparation of cost estimates and budgets. Control, so controlling the costs, controlling the controllables, understanding what's in your control and what's outside of your control, monitoring and reporting, and then dealing with contingencies also. And as part of that, I'll be preparing you for the 20-question multiple choice question as well. Now, some of you may notice on that last slide there was 3 little question marks. Watch out for those 3 little question marks. If you see them, they may be pertinent to the multiple choice questionnaire. Okay, so this is complementary to the Capital Works Management Framework Guidance Note 1.3 rather than a summary. So it's not designed to simply replicate what's in that document. That document is freely available. It's written in simple, plain English. It can be downloaded from the internet and you can read it. You probably have already, most of you, 75% of you have experience with it. 25% don't, so maybe this will be your first introduction to it. But it's intended to complement that document as opposed to simply replicating it. So I will try to give examples. I'll try to also ask you for your examples. We'll begin by focusing on establishing the project budget. It's probably something that a lot of you have already done. Certainly it's something that everybody does at some stage. And there's quite a lot of work that goes into it. And we consider, when we're establishing the budget, the triple constraints model. And I'll just bring your attention to these little 3 questions on the side of that sentence. That may be appropriate for later on. So in terms of the triple constraints model, this is the competing constraints between time, cost, and quality specification. And I know it's something that you've likely come across in project management. It's a well-established principle, and it works on the principle that as time increases for design and for planning and scheduling, the cost can come down. As quality increases, the time is likely to come up. And it's trying to find that balance between those competing constraints. So I wonder if you were to ask yourself the question, which of those is within your control? You think about projects that you're working on, what element can you have the greatest amount of response to by making an effort, putting an effort into it? For me, I think it's time. For me, I think that time is the issue that I have the most amount of control on, because specification and cost are outside of my control. So if I'm allowing procurement, for example, I'll allow the greatest amount of time that I can to allow me to go up and get prices from local suppliers. So my experience in the past 20 years has been working for developers and contractors and subcontractors at the cutting edge, if you like, of procurement. And what I notice is sometimes the contractor is only given 4 weeks to prepare a very detailed tender submission. He passes that risk on to the subcontractor because they'll have maybe a project team meeting a week in advance. So the subcontractor might be given only 2 weeks. But the subcontractor wants to put his individual prices on, so to establish labour and supplier prices, we may be only given a week. A week to review 100 drawings, 1,000 word specification, and to produce a detailed price. And invariably what will happen is the impact will have a knock-on effect on cost. So if you examine this triple constraint model, we'll be coming back to it. And I sometimes think of it as a Venn diagram. If you look at that Venn diagram on the screen there, getting the balance, the sweet spot right in the middle, that little purple spot right in the middle, that's the utopian dream, if you like. It's the rare unicorn of projects that comes along that just finds the balance between whole life cycle costs, quality and affordability. And of course, as procurement professionals, you'll have to consider the entire life cycle costs. So not just the construction costs, but also the maintenance costs, the operation costs, facilities management, cost of energy for the building, and eventually its demolition and recyclability. So when we consider why do we prepare a budget? Well, it's inherent in our responsibility to identify an amount of money that the sponsoring agency is prepared to spend, and then to get approval from the sanction authority. But please bear in mind, and that's there for a reason, please bear in mind that the information may be incomplete and it may be imperfect. And that goes back to time. The more time that you can spend on the preparation of tender documents and detailed design submissions and assessments and investigations, the greater certainty that you can have on the final outturn cost. So we consider then the 4 stages in budget preparation, and we might start with a feasibility study. Some people call it a back of an envelope calculation. So it's a simple preliminary cost of the entire project, and it's produced basically on established norms. So if you're used to doing schools, for example, if you're working in the Department of Education, you may have a cost per pupil, or you may even have a cost per classroom or a cost per 16 classroom. One of the recent innovations, if you like, in terms of design as a coordinated approach is the production of a generic design for schools for the Department of Education. So there's a lot more certainty on the cost of that building above ground, less so below ground, because that can apply in different site conditions and so on. We'll also consider risk assessment and a contingency fund. And I know that my colleague Sonia is going to be doing a presentation tomorrow on risk assessment. Certainly Stephen Ash will be talking about risk assessment. He'll be introducing I'm sure, some information from the 2020 line sight forecast, which is currently has been produced in the last couple of weeks. And that forecasts that inflation is to increase between 3 and 3.5%, compared to a minus 6.2% contraction in the consumer price index. So knowing which index to use and knowing how to apply it will be important. It's also important that any additional known costs, so if you have, for example, contributions for the ESB, contributions for other state bodies for connections, etc., if there's rock on site and you need to demolish and break out that rock, if there's buildings that have to be demolished, that they also be added in at budget preparation stage. So in terms of accuracy, the budget should predict the tender price, which is a difficult thing to do. I mean, how do you predict into the future? And this is what I was talking about. Sometimes there's an art and there's a science to it. Well, the easiest way to predict it is if you have a very simple, comprehensive design, and you can compare that design with similar work carried out under similar circumstances in a similar macro environment at a similar time. So looking at tender price information for the last 6 months for projects carried out in a similar area and a similar nature, you could accurately forecast that you will use those rates again in the next 6 months. If you were to compare a building in the city centre in Dublin on a brownfield site where there's likely to be adjacent temporary works, where there's likely to be deep excavations, underpinning, where there's likely to be contaminated soil, that's going to have an impact. So when we consider cost control, that image there that you see, I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger for you. That image there is taken directly from Guidance Note 1.3. And I've replicated that to make it a little bit easier to read. Apologies for the text is a little bit small there. But on the left-hand side, you can see the project stages, and you can see the capital appraisal in blue, in the blue column. So the first two stages, there's no real involvement in terms of the budgets, procurement officers and quantity surveyors. But as soon as you start the planning stage, stage 1 of capital appraisal, that's when the budgets will be formulated, an initial cost assessment of feasibility studies. And they will be based on the feasibility stage that the design team have implemented. So I like to consider these images and these colours, and these are directly taken from the CWMF Guidance Note 1.3. I like to consider when I see green, red and amber, I like to think about a traffic light system. I think about the design team getting the green light to advance, and then they hit project review 1, and at that point they have to pause, they have to apply for expenditure to the sanctioning authority. They'll get a sanction, but it will only apply until project review 4. So every time there's a red interruption, if you like, that's when they have to stop and they have to review it. I consider the cost control activities that will follow along with the design activities, and we consider that there's a constant input from the quantity surveyor, from the procurement officer as to the budget, so based on the initial feasibility stage. And then at project review stage 2, and this is something that there's a question on later on, a little gimme for you there, project review stage 2, there is a requirement there for the quantity surveyor to develop an outline cost plan. And the outline cost plan will be based on the sketch scheme, which could have approximate quantities. So you might move away from a simple exercise, 1,000 square meters at 1,500 euros a square meter, to an elemental cost plan, which breaks it down bit by bit and puts approximate quantities and approximate rates based on market conditions. As that develops, as the information develops, the sketch will become a little bit more detailed, it will become developed, you'll have this developed sketch scheme, and in tandem with that you'll have a developed cost plan. At that point you need to stop again, the red light comes on, the statutory approval, prior to the project being submitted for statutory approval, there needs to be another review at that point, and the sanctioning authority will determine whether at that stage they're going to go ahead and how much they need to set aside for contingencies, etc. Following on from that, there'll be another intermediate project review, and that doesn't require further information unless the costs have escalated beyond those that have been already approved. And this is where I suggest the time comes into play. If you consider that triple constraint model, the greatest time pressure that I have seen on architects, on planners, or on planning consultants, on the design team, the engineers and the contractors is after planning consent or statutory approval has come through, but before the tender documentations have been prepared. That small window is something that if it's stretched out, if there's greater time there given to the design team, there can be greater investigations carried out, there can be greater studies done. It's the rewards from a value engineering perspective, so value engineering where you might get either the cost consultant or early contractor involvement to come in and review the planning, review the permission that they have and determine if there's a better way to construct it. At that time, if you can afford the time, and this is what I was saying about control, if you can afford to give more time at that point, you're likely to get a better outcome for your project. So that moves us on then to project review 6, where you'll have an approved detailed design solution. And at this stage, the quantity surveyor can develop a detailed tender cost analysis, and they'll be analysing that using the appropriate methods. So they may be using the most economic advantageous tender method, where they're considering what would happen if the design changed, what would happen if the provisional items that were allowed for into contingency, if they changed, how would that have an impact on the rates? We now have items there for compensation for delay, and if there was compensation items, how would that have an impact And I've sometimes seen at tender cost analysis stage, somebody who was in maybe second or third position actually end up winning a job based on their compensation event values that they've submitted. I think an important thing as well for procurement professionals at this stage, if you're considering the documentation, is to evaluate using the spirit of the guidance document. So Stephen spoke earlier about principles and the principles that we're advising you on today rather than specific answers to questions, that it's a principles-based approach. The same thing applies to the principles in the guidance document. So for example, if you are doing the MEAD approach and you have 30% set aside for pre-qualification documents, I've been involved in projects where I rang up and to find out where the position was for the contractor, and they were maybe second or third position, and then that gave us some hope because they were only focusing on price. We were hoping that our pre-qualification submission would possibly advance us up the ladder a little bit. And the response from the procurement officer on the other end was, no, we only look at the lowest price. And I said, what about the 30% that's set aside for pre-qual? Oh, well, we only look at that on the lowest price contractor. And if there's a reason not to give him the job, we don't give him the job. So I'm not sure if that's the spirit of that guidance. Now, no one's expecting procurement officers to assess all 65 submissions if you have 65, but surely the top 5 should be assessed, or the top 10 should be assessed, so that you can accurately arrive at the best outcome for the client. Project Review 7 then will be at the implementation stage. So you can see there stage 3 implementation, which aligns with stage 4 and 5 construction and handover, and that will manage any change controls, so any variations that there may have been. And this is where the bill of quantities is useful as well, to manage those change orders that you're using, bill rates, tendered rates, and helping to develop an analysis of the outturn cost. Now, later on, we'll be looking at this again. I'll have an abridged version of it, and I'll be comparing those stages with the budgets and the allowance that you allow for inflation and the allowance that you allow for contingencies, and how that can differ depending on whether you're working on a general contract or whether you're working on a specific heritage project. Any questions so far, Martin? Anything turning up in the chat box there at this stage? If there is, feel free to...
No, I don't see anything in the chat box at the moment.
Not at the moment. Okay, well, feel free to interrupt if you do. Okay, so here's a question for you then. I have a question for you guys. What if the budget is underestimated? Why would that be a problem if under-provision is made? And I guess, it's not desirable because the project mightn't have been approved if the truth had been known about the project. And then there may not be funds available. And I guess we're all fishing from the same pond. So whatever funds are being depleted from that pond to fund one project are affecting funds that may have been available for other projects. And so we're mindful of that to try and get an accurate budget. Now, the opposite can also take effect when you overestimate, and we look at that in a moment. How will the sponsoring authority respond? And again, you see the 3 little question marks there. They may decide to reduce the scope. So, for example, if it's a 16 classroom school, they may decide to reduce it down to an 8 classroom school. They may try and satisfy the requirements in other ways. So, for example, they may provide a temporary building as opposed to a permanent structure. They may provide additional funding, that's within their remit also, to trust that the information that's been given is correct and to approve the business case that's put forward for additional funding, or they may abandon the project entirely. What happens if the budget is overestimated? And this is something that is probably in some cases more likely, because what happens is there's various different layers of contingency. And that's not desirable either, because then what you might have is you may have funding spent on projects where it could have been effectively used on other projects that maybe might have been more deserving of them. So those overestimates and those layers and layers of contingencies that are sometimes built into engineers' design or sometimes built into the quantity surveyors measure. Quantity surveyors will sometimes have a negotiation tactic of over-measuring in excavation or concrete or muck to try and compensate the contractor for a delay event later on. off the books, as it were. Sometimes that's the strategy that's used. If there's additional contingencies that haven't been reduced as the project has been continuing, so say it's in at 10% at the outset and it continues to 10% at the end, well then that contingency may well be lost. And in many cases, it gets absorbed back into the overall building project, and so the value for money would be reduced as a result. Of course, there's also opportunities for the sanctioning authority to derive their own budget, and including the contingency funds. And examples of that might be where there's something that they're not aware of. It might be difficult to get market prices. Famously, the government would have used Japanese rates and rates that the Japanese tunnelling contractor had experience of using for the Port Tunnel. And of course, when they discovered in Ireland things are just a little bit more expensive than what they were based on. So every sanctioning authority, in accordance with GN 1.3, has a duty to maintain a centralised schedule of records of actual costs. So you have your projected costs and then you have your actual costs. And the easiest way to do that is in an elemental bill of quantities format. So you'll see a bill of quantities. It'll have a quantity of work. It'll have a description of that work. It will have a rate for that description and that quantity, and it'll have a total. And so if that varies, or if you want to prepare a cost plan in the future based on previous experience, you have that data available to you. And it's important that you make adjustment to that data for current market conditions and the current site conditions. So we could examine then, for example, this comparison that you might have between School 1 and School 2. This is a question that I have for you. Look at School 1 on the left-hand side, the Department of Education. It's a generic 16 classroom school. It's on a brownfield site, so that might be important. And it's in a nearby town, and it was tendered in 2020. Could you use the same data for another generic school, flat greenfield site, which is estimated developed in 2020? What do you think? That's a question that I have. And maybe before you answer that question, let's consider the information on the next slide. So let's say that you're doing that estimate and you're comparing an existing building with a new building. So you have your control building, your control model, and you're using that to establish the rates and the value for the budget on the new building. Your control building comes in at 16.25 per metre squared. This is, in this case here, it's a 6-storey office block, and the location of it may vary from the location in the new building. So maybe this is a greenfield site somewhere, whereas the new building is on a brownfield site in a city centre where there might be some adjacent buildings that require to be underpinned, where there might be some contaminated soil, where there might be some rock or underground services or other unforeseen items on the site. We consider the market. So how long ago was it that those rates were used? What's the likely impact? If you were to compare construction costs now and the knowledge that we have now compared to a year ago, would anybody have foreseen the impact of COVID-19, for example? Would anyone have foreseen that the market has constricted for two quarters in a row, which officially puts us into a recession? Would anybody have foreseen that 12 months ago, when construction price was increased year on year for the previous 8 years? The specification will have an impact on the control building comparison to the new building also. So if you have a building that has PVC windows, that has laminate floors, that has MDF skirting, and then your new building has hardwood windows, hardwood skirting, maybe concealed skirting details that are so popular nowadays, all of that is going to cost a lot more money. So we need to adjust the budget according to the spec. And then, of course, the final element of that will be the M&E and the M&E requirements, the mechanical and electrical requirements. And they can vary substantially from building to building, depending on the client's needs, depending on their ultimate plan for the building. They may actually afford, maybe in one structure, they intend to invest heavily in mechanical and electrical plant and equipment because they want to consider sorry, beg your pardon, there's two other elements there. They want to consider, there's your M&E there. They want to consider the life cycle costs. So the heavy upfront costs of a heat recovery system, for example, will pay dividends over time because you've less running costs. And that's something that might feed into it. The time factors may also feed into it. We spoke about time earlier on. The time to prepare the tender documents, the time to construct the building. If this is a rapid build project, I remember reading a report on the first rapid build scheme that went out to tender, and they had to abandon the plan because none of the submissions came back on budget. Rapid build sounds excellent, and it is excellent when it's done rightly, but it requires substantial infrastructure. It requires a factory with substantial investment in plant, and anyone who's involved in that will want to recover that. And so you're essentially buying the risk. You're buying out the time. If you're going to ask someone to do something quicker, you can have the old saying that the restaurants in the 1950s used to have as a reaction to fast food. You can have it fast and cheap, but it's not going to be quick. You can have it quick, but it's not going to be cheap. Or you can have it fast and cheap, but it's not going to be good. So we consider all of the different components that feeds into it, and time is one of those. Scale is another. If you have 80,000 square meters spread over 80 floors compared to 80,000 square meters spread over 4 floors, which do you think is going to have the higher cost per square meter? With massive upfront costs in terms of craneage, in terms of access and egress, in terms of deep foundations for a higher scale building. So that would also need to be taken into account. And the site constraints, if that's a steep, for example, access may be difficult, egress may be difficult, there could be underground culverts, there could be burial grounds, all of that will have an impact on it. And so the final element here could have as much as maybe 10 to 15% of a difference. So we've gone from 16.25 per square meter up as much as 17.50. So just bearing in mind all of the different factors that we take into account when we're using published data from previous projects. We now consider monitoring and reporting for the construction procurement consultant. And this is what I mentioned earlier on. I'm going to zone in here now at this point up here just to explain something on this margin of error. So this is based on research that my colleague in TU Dublin, Tony Cunningham, will have done on the margin of error with regards to budget. So at that early stage, at the feasibility stage, there could be plus or minus 25% margin of error. So you may have overestimated by plus or minus 25% or underestimated by 25%. As you progress, as the project progresses and you have more information and you have more time and more consultants have got on board and there's been more investigations, such as site investigations, etc., you will see a reduction in that margin of error, right the way down to as close as 5% by the time you have the outturn tender costs, or in a position to prepare the outturn tender costs. Your budget may be as well as 5% close to that. The contingency amount for general construction and the contingency amount for heritage projects, both of these figures are given within the CWMF Guidance Note 1.3. And what they advise is that you start off the project with a 10% contingency for general construction. So we'll talk about contingency in a few moments as to what you'd include in that. But you'd start with 10% and you'd gradually reduce that contingency as those known factors become more detailed, as the unknown factors become more known. You gradually reduce that down. And the target for capital works projects is, they actually say 1 to 2%. 2%, I'd be interested in your opinion on that as to how many projects you can deliver on a 2% contingency sum. But for me, I think possibly 2% might be a bit low. In private practice, we may see closer to 5% there in terms of contingency. Heritage projects, again, it's accepted that heritage projects are likely to have a greater degree of uncertainty. What they don't do, and I mentioned their projected figures, what they don't give is they don't give a figure at the outset. So they do give, this is the CWMF, they do give a figure that you should arrive at. You should arrive at a 10% contingency by the time you get to tender stage. That figure has been set out in that document. What they do say is they say it should be substantially greater than the general construction figure. And it may even have to be, you'd have to do a risk assessment on it. You may have to get some investigations done. If you have a project that's an old building that's to be conserved, for example, you have sliding sash windows that need to be restored. You might have plaster work that needs to be treated in a sensitive manner, artisan lime render plasterwork, for example. You may have rotten timbers. You may have dampness and mold and rot and infestation. There may be problems with compliance with BCAR, Building Control Amendment Regulations, particularly with Part B of the building regulations, particularly with fire. So for all those reasons, until the project is across the line, it's recommended that you have a substantial contingency sum. They don't say what it is. I would suggest 20%. I'd be interested in hearing your views on that. But they do say it should be no less than 10% by the time you get to tender stage. Inflation, and again, these are projected figures, but they do give some guidance on how you would establish inflation. And they recommend that you reduce the inflation as the time gets closer to tender stage and contract stage. And I guess by the time that you get to contract stage, some of these inflationary costs have been absorbed by the contractor. The contractor will be asked to buy out the risk for any project that's greater than less than 36 months, less than 30 months of building work. The contractor will be asked to buy out fixed price premium for inflation as a result of potential rises over the course of the contract. So I hope that makes sense, that little comparison document. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of information to get across there. I know there was a question earlier about the project review too. So at that stage, they developed outline cost plans. So if you were to look along there in that row, if you like, in the planning stage of the capital appraisal stage, development outline cost plan underneath review 2, you might have plus or minus 22% margin of error. Your contingency is going to be less, so it's 9%. So as your margin of error improves, your contingency lowers also. And if it was a heritage project, it might even be as much as 18%. You may allow something like 3.2% for inflation, and then you may reduce those figures for inflation as the project continues. Okay, so next up we're going to look at maintaining the project budget, and we'll review contingencies. I spoke about contingencies earlier on. We'll review how to arrive at those contingencies, what sort of items you might consider. We'll review whole life cycle costs, so the whole life cycle costs being anything associated with the building, and risks. So what should contingencies include? Well, identified items that will definitely form part of the final cost. So known knowns, but have yet to be quantified. So for example, you know you're definitely going to have an ESB connection, but it hasn't been quantified yet. Or you're definitely going to have finishes in this particular, in the staff room of a building, for example, but the architect has said that they're waiting approval for the final design. So you know it's definitely going to happen, you just don't know what it's going to be. You may have identifiable items that may or may not form part of the final cost. So it may be that the client has asked for options, they've asked for choices, some value engineering options. Maybe they're keen to consider, if they were to invest heavily in solar panels, for example, what the impact would be on the whole life cycle cost. So bigger initial capital cost, but lesser running costs may have an overall reduced whole life cycle cost. May also have an increased cost. I've seen people who do examples on the payback on some of this equipment, and you could be waiting 30, 40, 50 years. So it needs to be assessed. You'll also have identified risk items that might or might not materialize. So something that you know about, but it may or may not have an impact on you. So it could be a problem with the neighbours, for example, adjacent sites. There might be overlooking issues. There may be, for example, you might have services that are nearby that you have to protect. A recent project I was involved with, they had to protect the overhead cables for the Lewis, and it was quite a substantial amount of work. And in the end, they value engineered. The contractor got involved. He came up with an alternative solution that reduced the cost for the client, where they didn't have to involve Transport Infrastructure Ireland. Unexpected items that at the time of the budget preparation are not foreseen or not foreseeable. So COVID would be an example of that. Who would have foreseen COVID? Who would have foreseen There was an instance there recently where there was a body found on a site, skeletal remains. Nobody foresaw it. Now, if it had been adjacent to a monastery where there was previous history of that, maybe they should have. But in this case, it was a greenfield site. So that would have to go into the contingency sum. Identifying risks. There's going to be another presentation tomorrow from Sonia on identifying risks. And also Stephen Ash will be talking about the risk strategy, Stephen Ash, Director at Linesight. And so I won't get into too much detail on identifying those risks and dealing with risks, but I will say that it's part of the role of the quantity surveyor, it's part of the role of the procurement professional, that as the budget is progressing, each risk is identified, each risk is set aside, and most importantly, that the party that's best able to carry the risk carries that risk. So sometimes what happens is contracting authorities will apportion the risk straight onto the contractor. The contractor will go back to back with the subcontractor, and they will apportion that risk onto the subcontractor. The subcontractor, they're all working from the same pool of subcontractors, and the subcontractors end up subcontracting. And they could be subcontracting out to a guy who's two fellas in a van, and that's their entire business assets. And they're in no way able to bear that risk. So consider the impact on passing risk onto contractor. We've had several instances where contractors have gone bust because they've taken on too much risk, particularly for unknown uncertainties, under the ground conditions, etc., etc. So by all means, stick within the contract and stick within the guidance note and the advice, but where you do have some discretion about risk, consider who is best able to bear that risk. So I mentioned earlier on, we looked at the project review 1 and project review 2 and the various different stages. And this is the impact on contingencies and the impact on inflation and the overall budget. So the overall budget remains the same. The sanctioning authority suggesting to you that this core budget at the outset is what you have estimated it will cost to develop the project, and inflation was greater at the outset and it gradually reduces as you get closer to the end of the project. Likewise with contingencies, they gradually reduce and they gradually get absorbed. So they gradually get absorbed into the final overall budget. Yeah. Speaking of gradually falling off, we're on the final stretch now. Okay, we only have 2 more questions, 2 more slides to go, and then we'll have a little Q&A session. So we may even finish ahead of time. Wouldn't that be fantastic now? If we could manage the time constraints and get back on time. Whole life cycle costs then. So strategic information in relation to operation and maintenance costs. So we're thinking about infrastructure that may reduce the overall cost of the structure. So we spoke earlier on about heating systems, we spoke about solar panels, we spoke about insulation, the trend towards near zero energy buildings. I heard a previous discussion this morning, they were talking about the importance of energy and being energy aware. One of my colleagues in the Office of Government Procurement, Charlie Mitchell, is currently sitting on the International Construction Measurement Board, and they're producing a set of guidance documents for measuring embodied carbon. So that's going to be the next big thing, if you like. If BIM was the buzzword over the last 10 years, I think embodied carbon is going to be the buzzword in the next 10 years. I predict that within the next 10 years, we will be producing, and you as procurement officers will be producing tender documentation that will include the measurement of carbon. So that not only are you looking at the cost of the building, not only are you looking at the previous experience of the personnel delivering the project, but you're also looking at the carbon embodied in the project. And that will be particularly relevant for design and build projects where the contractor has a design responsibility. Inflation. So inflation also must be measured, and we have to consider the market trends. So we look at published information. So I mentioned earlier on the Linesight report. You'll see some information there about the costs of various different buildings, not only in Ireland, but all over the world. You'll find other similar reports produced by other quantity surveying practices. You have to volatility in price of oil or other energy sources may have. Price of steel is another one. I remember being involved in projects before, and there was a boom in China, boom in high-rise construction in China, and it had a huge impact in the price of steel. China being the world's major supplier of steel, it had a massive impact on the supply and demand and the market forces and the effects that had on steel. You may also have external shocks, external events that can affect the Irish construction market. So COVID would be one example of that. There was another example a few years back where there was a factory fire in Belgium, and this was a chemical factory, and it produced the main chemicals for the curing process for PIR insulation, so Kingspan rigid insulation. And overnight, the demand for that PIR went through the roof because the supply was cut out. They were the only factory that was producing that chemical that cured the PIR, and the price of PIR insulation went up by over 30%. I remember reading back in the days when I was in college myself, the 99, 2000, around about the time of all the Batu strikes, you would have seen the amount of cladding and precast elements being increased substantially over a short period of time because of the lightning strikes from Batu. So that will all have an impact on it. Because there you go, that's the end of my slideshow. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I hope you have learned something. I'm going to escape out of this. I'm going to pass over now to Martin, who's going to moderate a Q&A session. Martin, thank you very much for that.